Welcome to Globewatch with me, Charles Ebune, airing today from Studio 1 of our Cameroon Radio Television Global Operations Center here in Balatu, Yaoundé, Cameroon. 100 years ago, the First World War, which cost $186,333,637,000 went underway. The human cost was immense and the financial fallout was impressive. Hazardous to estimate, over 37 million people were killed worldwide, military and civilian. 1914 was a year of extraordinary contradictions. The New York Times of January 1, 1914 read, quote, "The year opens in a hope," end of quotation. And The Spectator, one of the leading global newspapers at the time, had concluded in its last edition of 1913 with these words, "Men have had their fill of fighting," and so it was. The First World War was the outcome of European diplomatic witchcraft, with the assassination of the heir to the Austrian-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, serving as the unexcusable pretext. 100 years after the war, is the world of 2014 different from that of 1914? My guest today is a professor emeritus of history. Professor VERKIJIKA, FANSO, welcome to Globewatch.
Thank you very much, Charles, for inviting me to your program.
On the eve of the First World War, precisely on July 27, 1914, it is quoted that the then British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, said, and I quote, "The lambs are going all over Europe and we shall not see them again light in our lifetime." Is it possible that you borrow that statement today?
No, you can see that after the events of that year, the war that broke up out that year, it has not been darkness all through. Although in between the time we still had another major war, it has not all been bleak. The year of 1914 was a year at the beginning when nobody expected at all that a world war would break out. And the war started in a very funny way. It started as a local conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Then it expanded unexpectedly to become a general European war, and then the World War.
Okay, Prof, can you let us make a flashback? Can you quickly remind our audience the deep causes of the First World War before we make a comparison with the world of today?
Yeah, the immediate cause of the war, as you already said in your introduction, was the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand of Bosnia, who was heir to the Austria-Hungary throne. But the fundamental causes of the war were rooted deeply in the history of European society in the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century. In fact, after the Congress of Vienna in 1815, there was a rise of nationalism in all Europe, which extended to the beginning of the First World War. Each nation wanted to be seen in its own right, and people felt that they should have the right to form their own government and to be right. Then there was the emergence of democracy when elected assemblies, particularly the lower houses in each, were there. People wanted to express their opinion rightly, and it was heard. And there were, in that 19th century, the building up of standing armies and alliances, standing armies first, and navies, which armaments, and which were just that in the event war broke out, you should not be left alone. And that led to alliances. You should not be alone. The Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente, which divided Europe as it were. And there were economic situation, rivalries, which spilled even up to Africa.
Because of the colonial
battles. And you would understand that even during the scramble for Africa.
Absolutely.
Yes. The European war would have broken out in Africa. And von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, United Germany, prevented this by convening the Berlin West African Congress of 84, 85.
Okay.
So there were other situations.
Okay.
Which would have done.
Sure, Prof. Which means that there was a certain international order in 1914, and an attempt to break that order led to the First World War. Let me just give you a quotation from Andrew Harman, a former British government advisor who has written to CNN. 100 years ago, geopolitical tensions are mounting as revisionist nations, including China and Russia, challenge key elements of the US-led international order. Extremely difficult to root out a major global confrontation today, because the battle in 1914 was to challenge the existing British British colonial order or the existing empires in the time. Is it possible, when you look at Europe today, to conclude that 1914 is not different from 2014?
1914 is not really very different, because what can cause a global war can never be determined. You see, like we said, it was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand by a Serbian. If that
Yes.
If that assassination had been caused by an Austrian-Hungarian, it would not have led to the war. But it was a nationalist, a Serbian nationalist, who did it. So today, it can still happen. And you see so many challenges that come up. When people want to think about their own, they are emotional. When we want to talk about Cameroon, when we want to defend our own country, we are ready for it. And if somebody provokes anything, suppose that we had someone who is already destined to succeed President Biya, and that person is assassinated by a neighboring country for no reason. How do we react? We will still react almost about the same way.
Okay. Do you think that Ukraine, you know, the problems of the Polish corridor, appearance and disappearance in the map of Europe, issues like that, do you think that when you look at what is going on in Ukraine today, is it possible for Ukraine to serve like the Sarajevo of 1914? When you look at the way the plane was shot down, because if Ukraine was a member of NATO, you know Article 5 of NATO says an attack on one is an attack on all. If that plane was shot in a NATO member state, certainly we would have been in a very different world today. When you look at events in Ukraine, is it possible that Ukraine can serve as the Sarajevo of 1914?
It can definitely serve as a Sarajevo of 1914. Why? Because the rebels in Ukraine who shot the plane are said to have used weapons provided by Russia. And you see, the world is almost dividing over Ukraine, particularly when the Crimea situation started. And now it is eastern Ukraine. Russia is supporting the rebels in eastern Ukraine. Europe,
is supporting the government of President Petro Poroshenko.
And so Europe is divided over the issue in Ukraine, and it can spark a war. The bringing down of the plane, pressure was mounting on Russia. You know, when the black box was being looked for, it had not been provided.
Yeah.
But pressure came. Russia pressured the rebels to hand the black box, which is now being studied and listened to.
Okay.
And the United States, which we can say is the leader of the West, was already pointing a serious finger at Russia. So it could spark another war.
Okay. Let's look at the First World War in some details. The former U.S. Defense Secretary, Robert Gates, said in 2008 during the National Memorial Day, and I quote, "The First World War is not well understood or remembered in the United States." You have spent much of your time on earth teaching history. What can be accountable for the fact that a majority of us don't understand the dynamics of the First World War?
First of all, this is an event which took place 100 years ago. There are hardly any people living today who participated or who knew much about that war. The books and everything written about that war, they are past. They are not current. So you can say that the modern world, unless brought back to the events that happened 100 years ago, will not be very conversant. And you know, the United States joined the war in 1917. They were not there at the beginning.
Absolutely.
And so, in fact, the war did not actually impact so much on the United States as it did on the other members of the Allied force, or the Allied countries, Britain, France, which actually stood against the Central Power. So the United States came late. Japan entered the war late as well. You know, at the time of this war, there were only 3 African countries that could share an opinion and decide where.
Which were they?
These were Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa. Ethiopia was the oldest independent African country. It stayed neutral. Initially, it was sympathetic with the Central Powers, with Germany and Austria-Hungary. But from 1916, when leadership changed and the new leadership took over, they became totally neutral. Liberia declared war on Germany in 1917.
On the side
the
of the
same
Americans.
Year, on the side of the Americans.
Because the
Liberia,
Americans joined the war after the Germans had killed 128 people in the famous airliner, the famous liner Lusitania, along the Atlantic.
Yes. The country that entered the war just almost immediately was South Africa, which was then a dominion of the British Empire. The Union of South Africa.
Established in 1910.
In 1910, by 1914, of course, they were already part of the British Empire.
Absolutely.
And a strong member of the British Empire. They immediately entered the war and organized the invasion of Southwest Africa, which is Namibia today. This was German Southwest Africa. These were the 3 countries, but Cameroon, the 4 German colonies, which were Togo, Cameroon, Southwest Africa, and German East Africa, which was Tanganyika, today Tanzania, the largest and most important of the German colonies, were deeply involved in the war, even though they knew nothing about the quarrel.
Absolutely. The former American diplomat, viewed as the father of the policy of containment during the Cold War period, George Kennan, described the First World War as the greatest seminal catastrophe of the 21st century. You are a professor of history today, emeritus. How will you qualify the First World War?
I think the First World War was the first major conflict that, in fact, devastated the world. As a matter of fact, there were other wars, the Napoleonic revolutions and all that, but none amounted to took the dimension of the First World War. It was total. It used large armies. And in fact, for the first time, a chemical weapon, the chlorine, was used by Germany to a large extent. This had not happened. Now we talk. It is a human rights abuse. It is an international insult to use chemical weapon, even today. If you do it, they try to prevent it. You know what is happening between the West, in fact the world, and Iran. You know what is happening in Syria. You know the fear, even with the Taliban and all these people, the fear that these weapons, if they get into the hands of these people, they can destroy everybody.
Okay, Prof, the principal factor which galvanized the entire world to a world war was an act of terrorism, because in reality, the assassination of
was a
Archduke
terrorist
Franz
act. Yes.
in 1914 by Gavrilo Princip of the Black Hand terrorist group.
Yeah.
When you look at terrorist groups today, Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, the Taliban, do you think that they have the forces of leading us in a dangerous direction like they did in 1914?
What is happening today, Charles, is that the world, as I see it, is already involved in a global conflict, which is localized in every area. If you come to Africa, you will take the situation in Central Africa, you take the situation in Sudan, you take the situation in Somalia, you are going even to DRC Congo. It is not peace. When you go to the Middle East, look at Israel and Palestine. Look at Iran. Look at Iraq, of all. Look at every country, Pakistan. Then we go now to Ukraine. You see, there are these conflicts, local conflicts, in which the world is directly or indirectly involved through the United Nations. We have, for the first time, a global organization that, even if it does not have weapons of its own, which can only organize and accept support from member countries, an organization that can speak and the leadership of the world can listen. The United Nations. It was not the case with the League of Nations after the First World War. It was not the case with the concert of Europe before the First World War. You know, when Britain tried very hard to prevent the outbreak of the First World War by convening the concert of Europe to discuss the affair locally, what happened? Germany told Austria not to accept
the Congress system.
The Congress system, so that they should discuss and end the whole thing peacefully.
Why do you think that it is extremely difficult to have a global devastating war today? You know that at the end of the First World War, the Paris Peace Settlement, which ended the war, when people like Benito Mussolini came later in Europe, Adolf Hitler qualified it a stab on Germany's back, and that led to the Second World War. Why do you think that it's extremely difficult to have a situation like the First World War and the Second World War?
It is extremely difficult because every country, particularly the leading major powers, are well armed to prevent, and each fears beginning a conflict that will lead to a situation that no one can tell. They know what weapons they have. No one wants to use it. And so while you prepare that in the event you are attacked, you will be up to date, defending yourself, self-defense, already that you will fight only for a just cause, there is this fear that chemical weapons, other dangerous weapons, can eliminate as many people. Nobody wants a finger to be pointed at him that you did this. No, it should not be the same situation, because the Austria-Hungary situation and Serbia, although it started between these two nations, the first finger was pointed at Germany. Germany, in fact, supported Austria-Serbia by trying to declare war, even against neutral country. You know why? Belgium, the Belgian forces in the Congo, supported the invasion of Cameroon in 1914, because Belgium was a neutral country at the beginning of the war. And Germany violated the neutrality of Belgium.
Established in 1830.
Yes, by passing through Belgium to invade France. And so by doing that, Belgium was dragged into the war, a neutral country. And so everyone When the British were in the war, the empire was at war. And so every British dominion, or the colonies.
Prof, when you look at the leadership today, focus as the leader of the world, Washington, and under President Obama today, when you look at the way President Barack Obama is handling the situations in Ukraine, in the Central African Republic, in other parts of Europe and in other parts of the world, do you think that any reckless leadership from Washington, D.C. can be very costly?
You know, some people have...
There has been a progressive pull out of American forces around the world. Do you think it is the right decision by the Obama administration?
You see, the Obama policy gives diplomacy the first place in every conflict. Please settle issues by discussing. Go to the table. Negotiate. That is why many people are saying that if it was George Bush in the White House,
Tony Blair in 10 Downing Street in London,
Blair, and
Putin in Russia,
and it would have been
very dangerous.
Really, really dangerous.
Okay, let's talk the impact of the First World War. In the middle of the interview, you said that the First World War had devastating consequences. Empires were dismantled. I'm talking about the Turkish Empire, the British Empire, the French Empire. The Russian came up with a new system of administration. Concretely, when you sit today and you look at a 21st century child, what can you tell that child? This is how the First World War impacts you 100 years after.
If I was going to talk to a child, a Cameroonian child, for example,
a world citizen,
about the First World War, of course, I will mention the generalities. The people that were killed or maimed, the countries that participated. I will talk about the cause of that war.
The nations which were born.
Yeah, the nations which were born out of that war. And then I'll come to Africa.
All right.
Now, take Cameroon. Cameroon today is not Cameroon that existed before the First World War. It was larger. And let me take you back to the event of 1911.
The dog bill and the exchange of territories.
The Agadir incident, they sometimes refer to it.
The Agadir.
Yes. In Morocco. How Germany took out of French hands almost all of French Equatorial Central Africa to add to Cameroon. Cameroon was one of the biggest countries, the biggest colonies. And after the war, what happened? Those territories which France had handed over to Germany were annexed into their former colonies.
And you and I would have been speaking German on this
set today. Oh my
today.
Goodness, it would have been that. But what happened again? That was not all. What remained of the original Cameroon was again partitioned by the two great powers, Britain and France. We still have the effect of it today.
Okay.
Even in what we call that after the unification, we are suffering the consequences of the First World War.
Okay. Professor Fanso, some 30 seconds before I come to you and still talking about the impact of the First World War. I take this quotation: every time you admire an aircraft carrier, eat a meatless sausage, sit under a sun lamp, wear a Burberry trench coat, or set your clock ahead for daylight saving time, you are reaching back to continue with World War I. Ruth Ben-Giat, Professor of History at New York University. Professor VERKIJIKA FANSO, Professor Emeritus of History, thanks very much for accepting to be guest on Globewatch today.
Thank you very much, Charles.
You're welcome. You're welcome, Prof.
Thank you.
On behalf of the entire production crew in Yaoundé, I'm Charles Ebune, and see you next week. Remember that you can follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, and of recent, you can watch us on YouTube. Bye-bye.